Welcome to Walk in the Shadows with me, your host, Tim Woolworth. This episode, The Highgate Vampire, is the fourth episode of the third series of our podcast. Just north of London lies Highgate Cemetery, one of the Magnificent Seven. These are 7 cemeteries that were created outside of the London city centre where city residents, well, most of them, could find eternal rest. The old part of Highgate Cemetery is 17 acres in total, comprised of 15 acres of cemetery consecrated for use by the Church of England and 2 acres for the burial of dissenters. The land was set aside in the 1830s for this sprawling necropolis, which was consecrated in 1839. This has become known as the Western Cemetery. In 1854, another 19 acres was purchased for burials under the name Eastern Cemetery, which still allows for burials to this day. The eastern and western halves of Highgate Cemetery are divided by Swain's Lane. Today, the woodland has crept back, obscuring the backdrop of London. The roots of sprawling sycamore trees and other foliage have reclaimed Gothic mausoleums and split graves asunder underfoot, especially in the Western Cemetery. Walking paths are slightly spongy where caskets for the estimated 173,000 permanent residents once filled in the earth below, but have since been pierced by labyrinthine roots collapsing the coffins and their occupants back into the soil. The plan for the cemetery was that 3 people were to be buried in a single vault to make Highgate as efficient as possible with the limited land it had available. Today, marble headstones jut out of the ground at strange angles due to tunneling roots, and mausoleums have been split asunder, and the vaults are ruptured through to their base, several meters under the earth. Consequently, the Western Cemetery is strictly off limits to the public, except through guided tours. Nearly every piece of land in the Western Cemetery has graves underneath it. Many of those interred are permanently lost to time. One wrong step by a wayward visitor may find no purchase but vegetal overgrowth, sending the sightseer careening into a 10-meter deep ruptured vault. The Eastern Cemetery is newer, more maintained, and allows for anyone to walk freely amongst its twisting paths during the daylight hours. Today, the cemetery is a place that is often enjoyed for its macabre, shadow-laden, darkly beautiful aura nestled among the striking backdrop of nature where animals and foliage have reclaimed the ecosystem as their own. Yet from the late 1960s into the 1970s, the natural beauty of Highgate Cemetery was cast under a pallor of evil. The cemetery was thrust under a spotlight when a twisted tale of cultists, magicians, a vampire, and vampire hunters became international news. If this topic intrigues you and you would like to hear more, there are bonus episodes in this series that only Shadow people have access to. With all topics we cover, our Walk in the Shadows bonus episodes expand upon the concepts in each season. To gain access to all of our bonus episodes and other perks like free merchandise, please visit the Shadow Realm for more information. The link is in the show notes. If I may have one more ask before we get to the good stuff, like and subscribe to our podcast. If you really vibe with what we're doing, please leave a review and tell a friend or two. We really do appreciate it. And after this short break, we will walk into the shadowy depths of Highgate Cemetery, where just past its gates, the specter of Highgate may still lurk to this very day. Some nights I walk home past the gates of Highgate Cemetery. On 3 occasions, I have seen what appeared to be a ghost-like figure inside the gates at the top of Swain's Lane. The first occasion was on Christmas Eve. I saw a gray figure for a few seconds before it disappeared into the darkness. The second sighting, a week later, was also brief. Last week, the figure appeared only a few yards inside the gates. This time it was there long enough for me to see it much more clearly. And now I think of no other explanation than this apparition being supernatural. This report, Ghostly Walks in Highgate, was published on the 6th of February, 1970, in the Hampstead and Highgate Express. It came to light a short time later that the ghost-like figure reported upon was not a specter. In fact, it was the exact opposite. That figure was the vampire-hunting exorcist, Sean Manchester, a man whose life goal is to answer the age-old question,
is there a world beyond death, a world of spirits, demons, and the dead who do not rest quietly in their bony dust?
Manchester found his answer lurking in the dark shadows of Highgate Cemetery, as did another who was essential to the story of the Highgate vampire, occultist David Farrant. As a listener note, there are 2 quintessential books written upon this topic. One is by Manchester, and the other is by Farrant. Manchester's book was hard to find, but I managed to obtain a copy. Farrant's book, on the other hand, is impossible to find. I endeavor to use primary sources for this show, but in this case, I had to rely on the works of other authors who have read Farrant's book or have interviewed him directly. Both men approached the Highgate vampire from different angles, but unfortunately, Manchester's version is the most well-known due to the scarcity of Farrant's book. So this episode will primarily feature Manchester's version of events. With the words of Manchester, I would like to set the scene by reminding the reader that,
to begin to understand the vampire at all, it must first relate in terms of the impossible become possible, a world where there is life in death. If the condition of undead is fully grasped, then we begin to unlock some of the mysteries of the vampire. One thing is certain, if we think of this phenomenon as haunting only past centuries, we deceive ourselves.
The story began in 1967 with a 16-year-old schoolgirl named Elizabeth Voidois. She was walking home at night with her best friend, Barbara, after a school day at La Sainte Union Convent. Their trip home took her down Swains Lane, which abuts Highgate. When they passed the north gate of the cemetery, they noticed something frightening. Between the destroyed stone slabs and the broken mausoleums, they noticed dark figures rising up out of the ground.
And we were walking down, having just passed the north gate, when we both saw the scene of graves directly in front of us. And the graves were opening up, and the people were rising.
Mere weeks after this event, Thomas O'Loughlin was walking home on Swains Lane after a night at the pub with his fiancée, Stella. When they passed by the north gate, Stella let out a blood-curdling scream. On the other side of the closed gate was a lurking specter of unknowable horror, with twisted features exuding stark malevolence. The sight of the specter froze the couple with abject fear. After a few interminable moments, the specter slowly dissipated into the shadows. When Manchester inquired about this event, Thomas O'Loughlin refused to meet Manchester at the cemetery at night to recount what he had witnessed. O'Loughlin went back to the cemetery with a friend shortly after he and his fiancée had witnessed the horror at the gates to see what they could find. They went at midnight. After scaling the wall at the north gate, they walked gingerly onto the grounds to ensure each footfall landed on solid earth. As they walked further into the shadows of Highgate, a deep, low, booming sound was heard. The sonic malice moved closer to their location, slowly. Wary of the environment and riddled with fear, the booming stopped very close. It was then that a dark, shadowy figure appeared on the path in front of them. Fueled by adrenaline and fear, the two ran back to the wall and escaped, unharmed, trembling from their encounter. This piqued Manchester's interest, and he began to look into the history of Highgate Cemetery. He found that at one point in the 14th century, a castle was erected that lasted until the 16th century before becoming rubble. The land was then utilized for several gentlemen's houses, including Sir William Ashurst, a banker and politician who had a seat in Parliament and was also the mayor of London in the late 17th century. Ashurst built a 3-story mansion, and after his death in 1720, the mansion was leased to men of refinement, including one nobleman from the Slavic lands during the height of Magia Postuma. After this mysterious nobleman's arrival, the area was rife with supernatural strangeness. There were reports of hobgoblins, ghosts, and demons creeping about the house and grounds. In 1812, the home became the Highgate School for young gentlemen, and several residents told tales of a tall, gray figure only visible via the silvery moonlight in the old garden. The Ashurst mansion was demolished in 1830 to establish St. Michael's Church, and the grounds below the mansion were utilized for catacombs that are locked behind an iron gate and currently house untold thousands of permanent residents. All was relatively quiet until Manchester was contacted by Keith, the boyfriend of Elizabeth, the young woman who had seen the specter of Highgate on her walk home from school. She had been racked with nightmares since her experience 2.5 years prior. During her nightmares, she had lucid awareness, likened to a dream within a dream. These dreams, on the liminal borderlands, were imbued with dread. She was haunted by a being with an evil, gaunt face and a deathly pallor. This monstrous, inhuman being tried to get in through her windows while she slept at night. Upon seeing this, she was filled with dread that paralyzed her to the point where she could not move any of her limbs. The shadowy figure would enter her room and stand at the foot of her bed, leering at her with the face of an animalistic predator. She would then grow dizzy looking upon the night horror, followed in quick succession by a falling sensation, and then unknowable darkness until she awoke the next morning. Despite visiting doctors who prescribed vitamins and other pills, Elizabeth's health had begun to fail her. She would not eat, she was dangerously thin, and was as pale as a cadaver on a coroner's table. In a meek voice, she told Manchester of her nightmares, nausea, and her sleepwalking spells. More concerning to Keith was 2 puncture marks that appeared on her neck. Manchester, upon seeing the symptoms, suggested that Elizabeth was being attacked by a vampire. During Magia Postuma, many of the victims also experienced a figure haunting them at night in their beds, draining their energy until death. In Elizabeth's case, it seems that the vampire ghost was a physical entity, as it had left the telltale marks of an ancient, undead vampire. Manchester and Keith placed garlic upon all of the windows and the door to Elizabeth's room. Elizabeth was then instructed to wear a silver crucifix. Manchester also provided a cloth necklace that contained salt. Keith was instructed upon what daily actions to take, including prayer and sprinkling the room with holy water. After a few days, Elizabeth started to show signs of improvement. She regained her appetite, the nightmares ceased, and she slowly transformed from a vampiric corpse-in-waiting to a healthy, young woman full of vim and vigor. Manchester's recommendations worked, but to Manchester, that could only mean one thing. The specter of Highgate, witnessed by Elizabeth, Barbara, Thomas O'Laughlin, and Stella, was a vampire. And before it could inflict more damage, somebody had to stop it. A few months later, in 1970, Highgate Cemetery became a place of intrigue. Several witnesses had seen a shadowy specter, and one young man had been knocked down by a tall figure with an animalistic face. None of the witnesses became vampirized victims in any way, yet there was palpable public fear. In lieu of human victims, Other alarming signs of vampirism were abound. The corpses of small forest creatures, mainly foxes, were found devoid of blood due to a slashed throat. Manchester stated in the press that the culprit was a vampire, and it needed to be dispatched via means that have worked for centuries. A stake through the heart, and then a beheading. He did not state this lightly.
At the beginning of my investigation, I was extremely reluctant to even mention the word vampire, but as inquiries proceeded, it became increasingly difficult to avoid. Indeed, as the evidence amassed, its omission was noticeable by its absence.
After his proclamation, vampire hunters began arriving. Despite their best efforts, they had no luck in finding the dark entity. Since going public on his theories, people started reaching out to Manchester to report things. One incident was relayed to Manchester by Anne, the sister of a woman named Lucia, which was likely a pseudonym Manchester chose to use. Much like Elizabeth, Lucia sleepwalked regularly. She also felt that she was being suffocated at night. She exhibited odd behavior, and there were several other alarming details. More importantly, she had 2 marks on her neck. Manchester awoke one night to an alarming phone call from Anne. In the midst of a bout of somnambulism, Lucia walked to St. Michael's Church and entered the cemetery through a point where the railing was in disrepair. She walked towards the vaults, and upon arriving at a locked door, she stopped, tore the crucifix from her neck, and collapsed. At that moment, much like O'Loughlin's experience, there was a loud boom that rippled through the area. Lucia's sister Anne and Manchester carried her home, where she awoke the next morning with no recollection of the events from the night before. The media was frenzied over this story as a vampire appeared to call Highgate Cemetery its home, and it hunted upon Londoners who happened to live nearby. Thames Television interviewed Manchester, and he led them on a tour of the suspected area where the vampire resided. After his television appearance, numerous vampire hunters showed up, scaling the walls, looking to cement their legacy as the foremost vampire hunter in the world. Also looking to cement his legacy was Manchester, who used his experience as a way to achieve local recognition. On March 13th, 1970, Manchester attempted to locate the vampire, only this time he had about 100 people with him as witnesses. He walked the group to the vault, where Lucia had led him during her sleepwalking episode. He tried the iron door to the vault, but it would not budge. With the help of 2 assistants, he was lowered into the tomb with some rope, taking advantage of the roof that had split at some point over the last 130 years. When he reached the bottom of the vault, he found what he feared most. There were 3 empty coffins. Inside of each coffin, he placed some salt, garlic, and a crucifix. Afterwards, like he had insisted upon for Elizabeth's room, holy water was sprinkled throughout the vault, then he was raised back up. He stood vigil for the night with the onlookers. At around 2 a.m., a loud, mysterious boom sounded again where they were located, but there were no vampires spotted. 5 months passed, and local news covered the sighting sporadically. Then, in August of 1970, a woman who was interred 44 years prior had been exhumed. Her body was left on the ground next to a ruptured vault. She had been burnt, her arm was missing, and she had been decapitated. The head was nowhere to be found. There appeared to be the trappings of an occult ritual, but whether this was a black magic ritual or the work of vampire hunters is not known. Manchester, as the one who started this craze, felt responsible and wanted to find out what happened. Going back to the area that he had visited before, he lowered himself into the vault again and came upon a sight he had hoped he would not encounter. One of the 3 empty coffins he had bound with the vampiric exorcism ritual was missing. He returned the next day with several assistants and Lucia, who was going to attempt trance mediumship. When Lucy appeared to be overtaken by another entity, Lucia stood up and walked to the door of a vault that adjoined the one they were in and began sobbing loudly. According to the inscription by the door, this was the vault where the decapitated woman had been laid to eternal rest. The door gave way with little resistance. The stench of decay from a vault sealed 4 decades prior was overpowering. The coffins had begun to rot due to moisture. Inside the vault, there were supposed to be 3 coffins. They counted 4. The additional one appeared much newer and in better condition than the other 3. Manchester steeled up his courage and slowly lifted the lid on the coffin that should not be there. Upon peering inside,
my torch lit up in unnerving revelation the sleeping form of something that had long been dead, something nevertheless gorged and stinking with the lifeblood of others, fresh clots of which still adhered to the edge of the mouth, whose fetid breath made me sick to my stomach. The glazed eyes stared horribly, almost mocking me, almost knowing that my efforts to destroy it would be thwarted. Under the parchment-like skin, a faint, bluish tinge could be detected. The face was the color and appearance of a 3-day-old corpse.
He was convinced that the corpse was that of a true vampire. Manchester explained that
the true vampire is usually exceedingly gaunt and lean with an horrific countenance, red glinting eyes, deathly pale skin, full red lips and teeth white and gleaming, the canines wherewith it bites deep into the neck of its prey to drink the vital streams, whereby it is reanimated and reinvigorated, are notably sharp and pointed. When, however, it has quenched its thirst for warm blood, it might become hideously puffed and bloated as though it was some filthy leech gorged and replete to bursting. The offal of the previous night's feast trickles from the corner of the blood-stained mouth. The eyes glare fiercely. The lips are drawn back from the razor-sharp teeth, and its breath is unbearably fetid and rank with corruption as it enters its undead sleep during the daylight hours.
As the sun was on its descent into the hours of the undead, Manchester began his vampiric exorcism rites. His first act was to nail a stake into the vampire's heart, but his assistants insisted that he not, because desecrating a corpse is a jailable offense. Instead, as he had done before, he proceeded with a banishment ritual that included an incantation whilst using implements like salt, incense, holy water, candles, garlic, and crosses. After the vampire exorcist had performed his duties, a shroud of worry clouded his thoughts as he knew the vampire had not been eternally dispatched, just merely waylaid from its blood feast. After several months had passed, Lucia went into another trance and told Manchester that the vampire had been moved to a new location. He went back to the vault, and the 4th casket, the vampire, and all the exorcism tools he had left behind to bind the undead creature of the night were gone. Shortly after Manchester's exorcism, another vampire hunter, occultist David Farrant, was arrested on August 29th under a full moon as he was seen scaling the cemetery walls. The police found him with a crucifix and a wooden stake. His intentions were clear, and he admitted his desire to dispatch the insidious specter of Highgate, whom he had believed haunted the grounds for over a decade. In court, he claimed to lead an organization of about 100 vampire hunters throughout Europe. His charges were dismissed. In September, Farrant led the press on a tour of the cemetery while carrying a cross and a wooden stake conspicuously hidden in a paper bag. There were no vampires located that night, but they found that there was desecration abound. Graves were opened, coffins removed, vaults had occult symbols painted upon their walls. There was a tremendous amount of damage, and it caused exceptional public outrage. Farrant vowed to monitor the cemetery nightly for the occultists responsible, while secretly wanting to confront the vampire. He was not successful in seeing either. Vampiric reports continued throughout the next year, as did Farrant's notoriety. On the night of October 8th, 1971, Farrant was again arrested. He was with a naked woman performing the rites of necromancy, the magical act of communing with the dead through the use of a corpse for information or prophecy. He was subsequently released, but not before proclaiming that he was a high priest of an occult order founded and run by Manchester himself, a charge Manchester vehemently denied. Whether true or not, the two are now inextricably linked in the public eye. Hi, Walk in the Shadows listener. I thought I'd give you a quick reminder that we have merchandise available on our website, including some new shirt and sticker designs for this series. You are also invited to our Shadow Realm, where you can help support your favorite paranormal education podcast for less than the price of a used paranormal book per month. In return for your support, you will receive some thank you merchandise, access to several WITS bonus episodes per season, and access to a private Discord server for discussions with myself and your peers. If you've taken the time to do so already, thanks for rating and subscribing to this podcast. If you haven't rated, reviewed, or subscribed to WITS yet, please do. We've got some great things lined up in our future, and several topics we can't wait to explore for you. Now, let's get back to our walk in the shadows. During the cold winter months of 1973, the media reported upon an empty mansion in North London that was haunted by a very unpleasant ghoul. The locals called it
The House of Dracula.
Manchester decided to investigate this location at night and brought two assistants with him: Veronica, a clairvoyant, and Arthur, a skeptic who was responsible for operating
The scientific equipment.
Upon entering, they were assailed by an inexplicable fog, cold spots, knocks, terrible odors, and Veronica heard voices in the home. With these experiences, Manchester believed he had found the lair of the vampire once more, and he returned in the daylight. In the basement, they found a black coffin that was larger than normal. The three muscled the coffin out of the house and into the backyard. According to Manchester, what they found inside the coffin was a true horror show.
Arthur rushed to fetch my case of steaks as I prayed for strength. Suddenly, I kicked the lid off the coffin and beheld something which shall ever remain stained upon my memory. In the half-light, our quarry looked fiendishly exaggerated and distorted, much worse than the time before in the vault of Highgate. Burning, fierce eyes beneath black furrowed brows stared with hellish reflection. Yellow at the edges with blood-red centers, they were unlike any other beast of prey. Flared nostrils connected to a thin, high-bridged nose, the mouth still set in its cruel expression with lips drawn far back as if unable to contain the fangs. The creature had not long entered its vampire sleep, and the hideous countenance was yet to become subdued by an undead repose. With a mighty blow, I drove the stake through the creature's heart, then shielded my ears as a terrible roar emitted from the bowels of hell. This died away as suddenly as it had erupted, and all became still. We witnessed the body shell cave in and quickly turned filthy brown, which soon became a sluggish flow of inhumane slime and viscera in the bottom of the casket. Arthur had been trying to use a camera as if he could not believe his eyes, but the intolerably putrid stench soon caused him to turn nauseated.
The coffin was set on fire until it was rendered to ash. As for the mansion, it was razed to the ground in the coming years to build apartments for the elderly upon the grounds. Shortly afterwards, the Sunday Mirror ran a photo of Farrant on April 8th, 1973 next to a naked woman and a cat in the cemetery. and quoted Ferrant as saying,
"Blood must be spilled, but the cat will be anesthetized."
Manchester was contacted for a reply and said that,
"My opponent intends to raise a demon to destroy me by killing a cat. I will be relying solely on divine power."
The ongoing imbroglio between the two occultists came to a head with the challenge of a magical duel on Parliament Hill in Hampstead. There were posters that were published to advertise the event that was to happen on April 13th, 1973, and both Manchester and Ferrant claimed responsibility for the posters. On the day of the event, as the crowd gathered to see the two magicians duel, the spectacle that was anticipated fell short of expectations. Manchester wrote that,
"There was no sign of Ferrant. When he had been called out for his boisterous claims, he had been fearlessly called to account and, like so many others who use witchcraft to instill dread, could not fulfill the least of his claims when the day of reckoning arrived. Ferrant's excuse was that he would have been lynched by the crowd of onlookers whose arrival was entirely due to the publicity he had created in the preceding weeks."
A couple months later, Ferrant was in the news again. He had been arrested once more, but this time he had photos of a nude woman dancing in a tomb on his person. In addition to the grave desecration, he had a couple other charges levied against him for other crimes. The nude rituals case was brought to court in June of 1974, and Ferrant defended himself. This case was a media sensation, especially when it was revealed that ritual voodoo dolls with pins stuck into them were sent as a warning to each detective who was slated to testify. During the trial, Ferrant said that his rituals were not necromantic, but rather exorcisms to remove the satanic influence others had imbued into the area with their black magic rites. The prosecution brought in an authority on magic, Francis King, who testified that the occult symbology on the floor in Ferrant's photos were indeed used in necromancy. Ferrant was sentenced to 4 years and 8 months in jail, but was released on parole 2 years later, in July of 1976. From the time he was released from jail until his passing just a couple short years ago, Ferrant kept up his spat with Manchester, with both magicians claiming their version of events to be true. As for Manchester, he remained vigilant. In 1979, Lucia had died. She was buried in Great Northern London Cemetery. After she was interred, there were reports of a lady in white, so Manchester stood vigil by her grave after concluding that she was the woman in white. He also concluded that Lucia was a vampire due to her previous exposure to vampirism through a vampiric attack. Manchester created a magical circle around her grave and performed his vampiric exorcism ritual. With tears gathering in his eyes, he began the ritual by saying,
"Whatever masquerades as this dear girl, Lucia, I beg thee to leave her place of rest and appear before me. If thou doest not this, I will constrain thee to appear before the Almighty God, his Son, and his Spirit. Do my bidding at once."
In the middle of the circle, a spider appeared. This spider was about the size of a large house cat and hissed audibly. Manchester staked the spider and proclaimed it emitted
"The most heartrending screech I have ever heard. It will haunt me for the rest of my days."
Upon dawn the next day, Lucia was lying upon the top of her grave where the spider had been dispatched. He reburied her that morning and knew that the Highgate vampire had finally been dispatched. This episode was researched and written by me, Tim Woolworth. with vocal assistance by Catherine Baczynski. The final audio engineering and creative soundscapes are from my fellow explorer of the unknown, Joshua Sean of 0G ITC. Hopefully this episode made a little bit of our paranormal world more normal for you. If you liked what you heard today, please review Walk in the Shadows and subscribe to hear more. As always, if you have any personal anecdotes, observations, or alternate explanations you would like to share on this or any other topic we've covered, or just maybe you would like to drop a note to tell us about any encounters you've had with the weird, you can always reach us via our email, contact@walkintheshadows.com. Once again, that's contact, spelled CONTACT, @walkintheshadows.com. If you want to learn more about this podcast or myself, please visit our Walk in the Shadows website. The link is in the show notes. On our website, you can find stunning merchandise available only through our Walk in the Shadows store. You will also find the resources used for this series, articles related to the content of our episodes, all of our social media accounts, and access to our Shadow Realm. Finally, thank you for your time spent walking in the shadows with me. I know your time is valuable, so I really appreciate you being here, in this moment. Until next episode, may you and yours be healthy, prosperous, and treated with kindness by everyone and everything you meet, both in the light and in the shadows.